But as of right now, California is 49th in the nation in terms of housing per capita. So we're second worst, only to Utah. And I don't know why that is. I have theories that are probably inappropriate for this venue. But Governor Newsom says that we need to build 3.5 million new units by 2025. This is sort of the going number that we're sort of targeting at the state level. And for a little bit of context, over the past 40 years, we have had 325 homes built for every 1,000 new people into California. So over the span of 40 years, we've had 19 million more people move into California and roughly 6 million new housing units built. That's obviously inadequate for the population increase that we're experiencing. And it's even worse here on the peninsula. We've been improving recently. And improving across the whole Bay Area region means that we have a 4-to-1 jobs to housing imbalance. Still very poor. To cherry pick against one of our counties, San Mateo County, between 2010 and 2015, San Mateo County created 72,000 new jobs and created only 3,844 new units of housing. That's a 19-to-1 jobs housing imbalance. So now they've been improving, and so now we're up, and I don't want to put air quotes. San Mateo County does a lot of great things. But,
yeah.
Shout out to Shelby. But so they're improving, and so they're up to a 7-to-1 jobs housing imbalance. And this is something that's talked about as a big win. And when you're comparing 7-to-1 to 19-to-1, it is a big win. When you're looking at it in terms of our inability to build housing, 7-to-1 jobs housing imbalance being a win, I think sort of paints the picture better than any of these other statistics can. And this is no longer just a problem for poor people, for sort of minimum wage workers, or for, it's sort of expanding to middle-class families, upper middle-class families. In Palo Alto, the average median house costs $4 million. You can't buy anything for under $2.5 million. In Sunnyvale here, where we are, the average median listing is $1.5 million. Again, this is not something that teachers can move into, that firefighters can move into, that not to mention all minimum wage workers are just completely priced out of ever being able to afford a house around here. And now, that problem gets even worse for the students. San Jose State has 10% of their students have experienced homelessness in the last year. Community colleges are actually facing it the worst. And this is a segue to tie in my boss's bill, as any good staffer would. Community colleges, roughly 20% of community colleges in the community college students in California have experienced homelessness in the past year. That's a very stark number. And that's true here too. To again pick on San Mateo County, they have about 45,000 students who are enrolled in their community college district. Now, that means that over 8,000 of those students are experiencing homelessness or have experienced homelessness in the last year. That's really bad. So we have a bill this year, AB 302, which Assemblymember Berman authored, that would allow community college students to sleep in their cars in a safe lot, a 24-hour safe lot. This is an extension of an existing bill that provides access to showers and bathrooms for students at community college. And this is not the solution, I think, but again, to paint the picture, that this is a huge win for a lot of community college students, and it's a huge relief for them to have a safe lot for them to park in on their campuses. Which again, the idea of being able to be homeless somewhere safer, it being a win, it sort of paints the picture better than, again, any numbers can. So I'm going to stop giving stats, but this is why the state is becoming more involved. This year, there's about 200 bills introduced by the state legislature to address housing. It's a lot of bills. This is way more. Last session was the first time it really started to shift, and this year 200 is more than ever before. This is not to mention, again, the work that's already been done last year, like the $4 billion bond, which everyone here, or not everyone here, but which was approved by the voters, and that's $3 billion for affordable housing, $1 billion specifically for veterans affordable housing, We also passed a bill for $250 source of ongoing funds to fund affordable housing. And there was SB 35, which was a streamlining bill to sort of speed up the process of housing construction in California. So as the state continues to expand upon sort of the work that they've already done, there are a lot of obstacles to creating new housing. And I thought one thing I was going to do quickly before, maybe not too quickly, but before I hand it over to the panelists was, one thing that's a very interesting way to look at this housing crisis is so many of the arguments like for building new housing are the same arguments being used against building new housing. So you could just take one thing, one entity, one element, and you could say that this is why we can't build more housing. Then you can take the exact same thing and say this is why we need to build more housing. So you take local control, you take cities. Cities want to maintain local control to build housing. Cities believe, and maybe none of these are my own opinion. These are all just things that I hear, luckily, every day. And so keep calling our office. And this is Ruth. This is my colleague down here in the front. Talk to her if you have any problems. Sorry, Ruth. Thanks for coming. City councils want to maintain local control because they believe that they have a better sense than the state of where housing should go, how housing should be built, and what fits in their communities better than the state does. They also say they have a better sense of sort of the micro level needs that the city has. This is maybe true, better than the macro level that the state has in terms of funding for sewage, funding for water, funding for parks, funding for school, funding for transportation. There's a lot that goes into building new housing that the city might have a better viewpoint of than the state level. Then there's unions. Unions will often be supportive of housing bills. There are a lot of bills this year, specifically with ADUs, that are being used to try to stimulate an increase of ADU construction. And these bills, however, will be opposed by the unions. They've come out to say they're going to oppose the bill if there isn't anything added to the language that would mandate sprinkler systems in new ADUs, because sprinklers are installed by union plumbers, and they're safer, and they want those jobs. And so on the one hand, it makes sense. It's good for the unions. On the other hand, the whole point of streamlining the process for ADUs is to make it cheaper. This does not make it cheaper. Then there's environmentalists. We need to maintain and strengthen CEQA. CEQA is the California Environmental Quality Act. To sort of simplify it, CEQA is basically something that says, as you build, keep the environment in mind. And so, which is great, we should. But then also CEQA has been used by a bunch of people to combat housing developments for no reason connected at all to the environment, just as a strategic mechanism to slow a construction project. I don't even know that word, so I'm going to skip it. To just slow a construction project. Man, this is easier when you're not asleep. And it increases time, it increases costs, and it overall just slows down the whole process. And there's traffic. If we build more housing, there are more people. If there are more people, there are more cars. So we have traffic, and we hate traffic. And there's parking. So there's a big push to get rid of parking, but people say that, well, if we don't allow parking, then people are going to park in neighborhoods. And if people park in neighborhoods, that stinks for everyone who already lives in the neighborhoods. And so you want to get rid of parking to make it cheaper, but then you have, on the other hand, the only reason people, this is again an argument, not my own, the only reason people want to get rid of parking is because developers are greedy, everyone hates developers, so we get rid of they want to get rid of parking. This is something that our liberal hero, AOC, has been tweeting about in Brooklyn, arguing to preserve parking, which is, in my opinion, a little ironic for someone on the far left. And then there's developers. They are the face, I suppose, of evil for everyone who doesn't want their communities to change. I think the argument goes, if we allow for more housing, everyone's corrupt. And so then on the other side of the coin, there are the for housing arguments. Give me 1 second. Yeah, if we had a timekeeper, they'd be holding up a card, but we don't. So we can just sit there and wait. So city councils these are all the arguments for housing. So city councils want money to build housing. They want to build affordable housing. They want to increase the rates of affordable housing. And because I think many of them do at least, and that costs a lot more money, so they need money from the state. They also need money for transportation, money for schools, so they want the state to get involved at the state level to provide all these funds. And also, at the same time, a lot of city council members, not in public, not in a microphone, will say that they like it when these bills get passed because they know housing needs to be built. But if the state does it, then they can say, oh, shucks, there's nothing we can do about that. The state made us do it. So they get their housing bill that they know is right, but they can blame someone else for it, and they don't have to get yelled at because they can just shift the buck to the state. So cities actually don't always hate us doing things with housing. Unions, this one's very obvious. If you have 3.5 million new units of housing, many of the big projects are built by labor, by unions, by building trades, etc. That's a great boon for building trades if you have like that much more construction. Not to mention all the other unions that have the plumbers. Everyone sort of builds down as you build these houses, creates a ton of jobs for labor. And a lot of the new jobs, or a lot of the new bills, include labor pieces in the writing of the bills. Environmentalists, they love new development because as we do not build housing but continue to create jobs, we're forcing poor people to drive from further and further away, just emitting CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. And they're not driving Teslas, right? These are people who are driving the older cars that are more smog emitting. Not to mention that as we continue to refuse to build up, that we continue to force to build out. So we're developing on green land, we're developing on undeveloped land, and so environmentalists are strong advocates for building up instead of out. Then there's traffic. If we build more housing near transit and near jobs, then people don't need to drive as far. The majority of the traffic that is in a city like Palo Alto, I'm from Palo Alto, they have issues too. To word it very politely. This one is probably telling. I love my city. But the majority of the traffic in Palo Alto isn't from people in Palo Alto driving somewhere else in Palo Alto. It's from people outside of Palo Alto driving into Palo Alto for their jobs. So we've created this false dichotomy of housing creates traffic, but it's just not true. I mean, we know that if we have housing near where people are working, they have other methods to get to work. Parking, we get rid of parking, we decrease the cost of building construction, we decrease the cost per unit, we increase land efficiency. Land is probably the biggest limitation, the scarcest resource in terms of building housing on the peninsula, and we're using it up a lot of times at ground level so that a car can have a home. But then people can't have homes, and we have a 3-story height limit, and so we're eliminating one whole floor of housing so that a car can sit there. So parking is like one of the main obstacles. And then we have developers. Everyone still hates developers, but we all live in a house built by a developer. And if I'm gonna live somewhere, I'd rather have it built by someone who's a professional. I guess I also don't know what the sort of alternative is. I'm not gonna build it myself. And I shouldn't. I mean, this is why we have specialization of labor. So you don't have to like them, but we do need developers to continue to build things. So we have a place to live, they build the housing. So this is sort of my way of saying, this is why we have housing laws that are supported by the same people and opposed by the same people for the exact same reasons, right? Everyone loves and hates housing because of traffic. Everyone loves and hates housing because of parking. Everyone loves and hates housing because of the environment or developers. So this issue is very sort of specific, and it's a very funny way you hear people screaming about the same things every day. We all sort of know that we need to do something. We all know the numbers, and you can see it. But we're fighting over something that doesn't really, I mean, that sounds way more thoughtful than it's meant to sound. It's not even deep at all, but it's just something that doesn't really exist, right? We're fighting over something and we don't really agree even on what that means. And so I hope this illustrates that so many of the arguments against housing and state interference are the same arguments for housing and state support. And there are even more arguments for and against, but I am going to stop talking. And I'm going to sit down and I'm going to hand it over to our panel. And we're going to start, everyone on this panel knows more about these things than I do. so please listen more to them than you just did to me. But we're going to go one at a time, again, 7 minutes each. Then we're going to open it up for a little bit of a discussion. We're going to start with Shelly Mazer. Shelly is the Redwood City Councilwoman, Redwood City Councilwoman. She's a champion. So also their bios are in your programs. But she's been a champion on women's health issues, education, and a strong housing advocate from a city who's actually done quite a good job with housing. In 2013, she was named to Silicon Valley Business Journal's 100 Most Influential Women. And she's great to have here because as a candidate, Shelly is also a candidate for Senate District 13, your state senator. And so as someone who's sort of got one foot in the city council arena and then one foot looking at the state level stuff, I just can't wait to ask you questions. I'm gonna sit.
Wow, I don't even really know if I should talk after all that shade you threw at San Diego County. I need some of my San Diego County people here too. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Is this mic too loud?
It's good.
Okay, just checking. So I'm going to do a couple of things. One, I'm going to share with you some results from a poll that just came out today. Probably not very many people have seen it. It's a new polling firm that has been doing some ongoing tracking. I'm going to talk a little bit. I also serve on the California League of Cities Policy Committee on Housing, Community, and Economic Development. So I'm going to share a little bit of insights on that process and how the league is thinking about things. I'll talk a little bit about some conversations we've been having across the 2 counties around housing and how my city council members engage in a positive discussion, even if they're not fully supportive of a lot of the state legislation. And then I'll just share with you a little bit about some of the things that we've done in Redwood City that have actually allowed us to build a lot of housing. I was just checking with our former assistant city manager. Luckily, he still responds to my texts. And in the last 10 years in Redwood City, we've actually built 4,000 units of housing. So we are trying to do our part. All right, so let me talk to you a little bit about this poll. It's an organization called Change Research, and they are using a new polling approach. So they did, I would look it up actually because it's kind of interesting. If you're interested in the presidential race as well, they did some polling on the candidates, which I won't talk about tonight, but it was pretty interesting. So they asked Californians what are the 2 biggest issues, to name the 2 biggest issues facing California. The top 2 that they named, housing and homelessness. Surprise. This I thought was interesting. They were asked about Prop 13 and had Prop 13 been mostly positive or mostly negative for California. People said, the biggest number was 38% said mostly positive, but 24% didn't know what Prop 13 was. Does everybody here know what Prop 13 is? Well, now you're not going to admit it if you don't, so we'll talk later if you don't. The 56% said housing costs are a strain on them. 88% said housing affordability is a big problem in their community. 88%. That is huge. And this was across the state. It wasn't just this area. So we're looking at a statewide challenge for all of us. Now, I think you'll like this last one. The majority, I'm not a subscriber, so I just get the top line, so I didn't get the actual number, but the majority did say they support SB 50.
61%.
There you go.
61% was, I believe, the number.
All right. So I thought it was interesting that they're pulling on a whole variety of issues. They're pulling on education, they're pulling on transportation, a whole variety of things. But housing clearly is on everybody's mind. And I think, I will say, whether you support or don't support a variety of the bills around housing, or the other work that's happened in the Bay Area around housing, one thing that it has forced us all to do is to talk about it and to be paying attention to it. And so I think no matter where you sit in that space, you have to recognize the value of making us all have this conversation around housing and what can we be doing to address the issue. So let me tell you a little bit about the League. For those of you who don't know, the League of California Cities, it's our association as cities. So council members join, city managers join, city staff, etc. The league tends to be, well, I would say in Sacramento, it tends to be characterized as the league of no, particularly when it comes to housing. So it's been interesting this year to sit on the housing policy. So they make their decisions through these policy committees. So they bring bills and topics in front of the policy committees, and then we give our input, and then we vote, and then they take it to the league board, and they decide what they're going to do. So the very first meeting that we had this year, the major topic of conversation was SB 50. Now, Nancy Smith, who's also your council member here in Sunnyvale, also sits on this committee. So we, in fact, on SB 50, we wanted the league to take a neutral position because we felt that we could have a greater chance of having a conversation with the author. Let me just ask, does everybody raise your hand if you don't know about SB 50? I'm not going to go into all the details of it. I'm just curious, like, okay, so most people know. It's a proposal by, and you're going to talk more about it, right, Aaron? So it's a proposal by Senator Wiener, which would streamline a lot of housing approval in cities, and in particular focused on housing, multifamily housing being built around transit. Is that a good summary?
I'd say it's more of a zoning bill than a streamlining bill.
Yeah, you're right. It really is about, it's more about zoning. Thank you for that correction. Anyway, the league's position is currently opposed. Nancy and I had asked them to work with the author more so that we could understand, what might city council members be willing to accept. And we felt that if we weren't in opposition right away, that we might be a little bit more successful in having that conversation. That being said, we're still working in that area, but the league has, so we sort of looked at some other bills, and I'll just share with you a couple of them because they're kind of interesting little, not big bills around housing, but they're smaller ones that make a difference in some people's lives. So one of them is around whether landlords can ask on their rental applications whether or not somebody has been in prison. They're currently allowed to ask that, and as we know, when people get out of prison, they need a place to live, or they're not going to have a chance to come back and be contributing members of society. And so people get screened out of the housing process pretty much right away. Would you say that's true? Michael, you've done a ton of work in this area. Luckily, after an hour-long conversation, the league is going to be supporting a bill that takes that requirement off. It will also be supporting... And the box. Yeah, and the box. It's already been done on job applications, right? And so now we're moving it over to housing. Another one the league will be supporting is a bill that requires landlords to take housing vouchers. Section 8, federal housing vouchers. Currently, landlords do not have to accept them as a form of payment. There's a bill that is proposed that would require them to do so. The league is going to hopefully support it. The housing committee did recommend it. I know, it's good, right? And then there's another one that was about notification around rent increases that requires a longer time frame when people are going to be receiving rent increases. And so the league is also voted to support that bill. But it is a tough conversation, and part of the reason why it's tough is you have representatives from across the state. So we've got there's several of us from this general area, from the Bay Area. There's people from Fresno. There's people from San Diego. There's people from Sacramento area. So we're all looking at it from our own lens, and our lens impacts and our own communities that we're representing. And I'm not even the one with the baby in my can't talk clearly. And so we're coming at it all from a different perspective, but I will say for the most part, Zach talked about the local control piece, that city councils tend to want to have control over, not control, but have an opportunity to work with their communities around how things are done. Sometimes they want to have control, but they just don't want the state to take charge of that. So that is reflected in a lot of positions that that are taken at that level. Now, at the same time, I'm also on the board of the Peninsula Division of the League of California Cities. Isn't this awesome how you're getting a really great insight into the League of Cities? That's why you came, right? I knew it. You're welcome. But the Peninsula Division is also trying to take a little bit more, we're trying to push the league a little bit, we're trying to be a little bit more progressive on the policy positions that we take. And so we've been working to talk to our members up and down the peninsula to say, like, what are the things that we could live with in bills at the state level? And actually the league is taking that approach too. They did do a survey with all of us to talk about, what were the things we could support. No, I mean, actually people were supportive of density, they were supportive of height, they were supportive of building around transportation. They had some ideas around like how close or how far you should be from transportation, what types of transportation should be included. But in general, those types of things were supported. And that was true both at the state level and across the county. Our city council representatives from across the county were generally supportive of those types of ideas. They were also supportive of getting more funding from the state. Surprise! But I want to say, like, I can see why people have a concern about that, but the reality of the matter is cities used to have redevelopment agencies, which allowed them to move faster on building affordable housing. Governor Brown shut redevelopment agencies down during the recession, and that took away a lot of the funding mechanisms that we had at the local level to build, in particular, affordable housing. So I think there is a bill this year to reestablish them in some shape, not exactly as they were before, but to provide some measure of support for cities to be able to do that work. Okay, let me just talk super quickly about Redwood City. I mentioned that we built 4,000 units of housing. I want to talk about a couple of ways that we did that. One is in our downtown, as we redeveloped our downtown, we developed a plan for that. Zach mentioned the CEQA process. When we developed that plan, we did the CEQA process for any development that was going to fit under the guidelines of our plan, and that allowed the 2,500 units of housing to be built within about 5 years. Because developers knew when they came in, they knew what they were going to get. They knew if they conformed generally to the guidelines of the precise plan that they could build, and they could do it quickly. We had to make some changes because we didn't include affordable housing originally. We now require 20% affordable, both in that downtown plan, but then across the city. We do have a whole variety of policies. The ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, that keeps track of policies that cities have around housing. And there's a list of about 18 that they have been tracking for a while. I will say for Redwood City, we have all of the ones that they have with the exception of rent control. And our council has and continues to say that rent control is not something that we're going to support at this time. So I guess I'll stop there, but I did want to give you just a little bit of a sense of sort of what's happening at the different levels and the conversations council members are having around housing, and so hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into that.
Thank you very much, Shelley. And it's worth noting that when I'm in San Mateo County, I pick on other people. So like we're in Sunnyvale, so Sunnyvale's the best, but we go to San Mateo County, they're the best, they're doing everything perfectly, Redwood City's great, and then Sunnyvale has all these issues. But, I'm kidding, Mr. Mayor, I would never do that. Next up is Michael Lane. Michael is the Deputy Director of Silicon Valley at Home. Prior to that, he worked for Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. He's also the President of the Board of the Housing Leadership Council of San Mateo County. And previously he has been an elected official, both city council member and school board, and he is like a true policy nerd. And I mean that in the nicest ways. I learn a lot from Michael whenever I have questions, so I'm handing over to you.
Well, thank you. Good evening. Can you hear me okay? It's wonderful to be here with you. For me, Livable Sunnyvale is really a model of engaged citizenry and progressive and compassionate activism, and so it's wonderful to be here with you all this evening. And we're also very lucky to have electeds, like Shelley and Mark as well, fighting the good fight and standing on principle even when it's very difficult. These are very stressful times and very challenging issues that we're dealing with, and that's why these issues are not solved easily, but either at the local level or at the state level. So many different stakeholders with different opinions about how we got into this crisis and how we're going to get out. We really appreciate those who are willing to sit down and talk through the issues rather than just demagogue it, which we've seen in various venues without naming names. So I think it's important that people of goodwill can get together and try to work through these issues so that we can really have a more compassionate and just society. And that's really fundamentally what this is all about. How many of you have heard about the CASA Compact, what we call the CASA Compact? Okay. I want to just talk a little bit about that before we talk about state legislation, because that's become kind of a lightning rod, and I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about what it was and what it actually did. And try to demystify that for you and make it less scary than it may have sounded by some who have been purporting to explain what it is without actually including accurate details. But in general, this is just a policy document that was developed, and it came right out of Plan Bay Area 2040, which is our sustainable community strategy for the 9-county region, which is mandated by the state and brings together the regional transportation plan and the regional housing needs allocation together so that we're trying to plan better in terms of land use and zoning for our transportation needs and our housing to go together. So trying to be more coordinated in that way, and of course AVAC and MTC have merged as well, and so that's additional movement in that direction. But in that document, which ultimate goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save the planet, it said we need to drill down particularly on housing. MTC has been known for its transportation plans, etc., but we really need to drill down on the housing. We receive state and federal allocations for funding for transportation. Really, housing has not had that same level of funding to meet the need. Obviously, the funding for transportation and transit options is not sufficient, but it's even a greater dearth of funding for housing. You look at the federal and state level, at least over the past decade or so, we're starting to turn the corner on that as voters have agreed to invest in this area, particularly in California and in the Bay Area. We're grateful for that with local measures as well as the state farms, which Zach had mentioned. But so the idea was, let's get a group of stakeholders together who represent various interests, who normally don't agree on much at all. And quite frankly, when this was first proposed, many of us were very skeptical about what could possibly be produced through this process, because we'd seen this movie before where even when you lock people in a room, all they do is go after each other instead of the issues. But the good news is that over about 18 months, we had representatives from labor and the environment and cities and county electeds were on as well, business community, equity groups, all coming together to say, if we set aside some of our initial demands, what would we be willing to live with to try to come up with a broad suite of policies that could actually help address the affordability and availability crisis for housing. And so over that 18 months, there was a steering committee, but there was also a technical committee with experts in various fields in terms of how you actually build the housing, what the feasibility is to do this, what kind of protections do tenants have, what are the best practices that we already see in local governments that could be then scaled across the region, for example. But this was really limited to the 9 counties in the Bay Area. The idea was if we do have an emergency, then we should act like it and come up with a plan and get behind this to try to make some movement on the issue. And so that document became the compact. It didn't just drop out of the heavens. Last December, there were public meetings and hundreds of hours of meetings that were open to the public, that were taped, transcripts, etc., and are available for people to review. And there were opportunities for public comment all the way. The idea was that those who were selected, because you couldn't have all 101 cities represented in this process, you'd have individual cities that would then go back and report on what was happening to other cities in their county. Would be the way that would be, and their own council members would be ideally the way that would supposed to work. And I actually sat, for example, on a subcommittee of housing for APAG, Association of Area Governments, which actually did have small city representation there. They could then take back and inform their other cities in their county what was happening through this CASA process. So we ended up with a document with 10 elements. And those elements broadly were a framework for how to address the housing crisis in a comprehensive way. And we ended up with what we call the 3 Ps. And those Ps are tenant protections for existing tenants who are facing pressures in terms of increasing rents, economic evictions, gentrification, displacement. So we needed to protect our existing lower income residents and communities of color in particular. preservation of existing housing. If we're losing our affordable housing stock, even as we're building it, then we're not making progress in terms of the available housing stock for our local workforce and mortgage workers in particular. And then production of new housing at all income levels. And obviously, when you have market rate housing, you can also have an inclusionary component to that. As Shelley mentioned, that Redwood City has, for example, when a developer wants to build new housing. But you also take pressure off the housing market in general, and that does help to some degree. It doesn't help with homelessness for folks who really do have a need for a subsidy for deeply income targeted kind of housing. That's not the claim that we're making. It's just that if you don't address the market as well, then you end up getting pressures to provide finite and precious resources for affordable housing to folks at higher and higher incomes who don't qualify for subsidized housing, but are finding it more and more difficult to compete in the market. So that's why we also need to find some opportunities to streamline moderate income housing to see if the market can provide that, and those precious resources for affordable housing can be directed to more deeply income targeted units. We think that's the best policy preference, but without that, for example, Governor Newsom's come forward as part of his initial budget proposal in January to dedicate $500 million to a mixed income program at Cal HFA at the state level. And the reason that there's pressure to do that is because we're seeing our teachers and first responders and others who are not necessarily poor, but are just simply being priced out. And so there's a pressure on local electeds at the state level as well to try to address this. And so that's why the 3 Ps framework, we think has a really good shot at that. Now, just to be clear, this Committee to House the Bay Area, which is what CASA stands for, has no authority to impose anything on anyone. This was basically a compact that was then ratified by MTC last December and by ADAG in January, not because they thought this would immediately be implemented, but then because they just allowed their chairs to sign on the document to receive the work and to thank the committee for those efforts. But from here on out, those policy ideas and those 10 elements would have to be translated into legislation at the state level. And the way I talk about this is there's lots of democracy ahead of us. Our members have their own ideas about how bills should look. Other stakeholders in Sacramento who weren't involved in the CASA process and are statewide have their own ideas, and we have to then engage with those stakeholders as well from Southern California and the rural parts of the state, for example. It can't be just the Bay Area telling people, what the housing policy for the state is going to look like. We need more input. Bills have to run through committees. They have to take amendments. They're going to look very different than necessarily what the CASA compact was proposing. And of course, then the governor has his own vision and what he's willing to fund through his budget, et cetera, and we'll negotiate that with the speaker and the Senate Pro Tem, both to come up with priorities for funding in the budget, but then also with the policies that he's willing to sign into law. And of course, as you know, homelessness continues to be a major issue for the big city mayors, and they've also got additional 8 California cities. You have the big 11 mayors who are also up there in Sacramento making their case for why they need funding and they need help from the state, particularly in the area of addressing homelessness. And so that's also been in discussion. So I just share all that to let you know that I think we did good work, but what was done here in the Bay Area is very difficult to replicate at the state level with statewide stakeholders. But I think the comprehensive framework of the 3 Ps is a good approach for every level of government, and one that we need to continue to work on going forward. But the CASA compact doesn't mandate anything, and quite frankly, SB 50 was going forward with or without this compact. Senator Wiener had introduced a bill last year, and by December 3rd, he already introduced SB 50. And so while we did have a transit upzoning aspect of the compact, it's a little bit different than actually what SB 50 looks like. That bill was moving forward with or without the CASA compact. And then just a couple other items that I'll close that had drawn the ire of some opponents of CASA was one was this idea of a regional enterprise, or the idea was, well, regional government's going to take over and tell us what to do and use eminent domain and do all these nasty things, which was actually not part of what the proposal was. But the idea was actually to provide a support to be added to local cities who had lost redevelopment and the staffing and the funding that went along with that, and to be able to be a benefit to local jurisdictions in providing the right data that they need to support what local staff are doing, to generate additional resources that can be directed for housing efforts throughout the region, to provide best practices and to make sure we kind of have a cohesive approach so that one city right next to another doesn't get away with just trying to punt off the housing to the jurisdiction next door so they can collect all the sales taxes with retail and office and commercial, et cetera. Because all of our incentives, as you know, in terms of land use and tax, it's all wrong. In addition to the neighborhood opposition you might have to a project, you also have fiscal incentives which actually disincentivize housing over against other types of development. That's why you see on the peninsula the rush for office and commercial developments, et cetera. And you see the reluctance to actually then approve housing to go along. So that was one piece. And the other piece were the funding sources that we might use to pay for some of these programs in the region, like providing legal aid if someone's facing an eviction, how would you pay for that? Or like if you had someone who needed temporary rental assistance because for whatever reason, the sickness or the loss of a job, they missed the rent, and then they would immediately become homeless because of their situation. Could you provide some temporary rental assistance? That's one of the ideas that come out of CASA. How would you pay for that? And there was a series of funding sources, and one, focused on property taxes as a potential tax increment that would grow like we did under redevelopment. But that was just an idea where folks were blue skying, and they included that as one possible source. And then people made the case that we were going to MTC, hey, they're going to come in and grab your property tax at the local level and take them to the region, where the idea was obviously property tax really have to remain within the county. But the idea was, could there be some kinds of agreements where some portion of that tax increment, that increase that we're seeing, particularly from increase in commercial development, et cetera, could that be dedicated for affordable housing? But that was one idea. And once again, all these ideas would have to be approved at the state level, come back to the region, be voted on by your commissioners, and the executive board aid bag, then come back to the local level of the approved. So much democracy ahead of us. None of this is a done deal, but people were actually wrestling with these issues and trying to identify ways to address the problem. And unfortunately, because there was some misinformation out there and folks demagoguing it, that message was lost. And so I just wanted to help clarify that today, and kind of be glad to take questions later tonight in the panel.
Thank you very much, Michael. And then we're going to go now to Aaron Eckhouse. Aaron is the Bay Area Regional Organizing Director for California YIMBY. He's a lifelong political activist. He's done years of housing and transit advocacy, as well as working on Obama's re-election campaign in 2012. And my favorite fact, I suppose, is that he's a lifelong pedestrian. That's great. I support that.
I'll walk. Everybody hearing me okay? So yeah, Aaron Eckhouse, as Zach said, Bay Area Regional Organizing Director for California YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. California YIMBY, we believe that California is for everyone, and that our housing crisis is a major obstacle to that vision being a reality. We cannot have cities for everyone, we cannot be a state for everyone if we do not provide housing for everyone. Zach touched on the 3.5 million home shortfall that we currently face in California. That is not a number that Governor Newsom picked out of a hat. That is based on an assessment from both the Legislative Analyst Office for the California Legislature, as well as the McKinsey Institute, have both working through similar methodology, come up with that number of how many homes we have failed to build over the past decades that we should have built in order to keep up with our economic and population growth, and in order for housing prices in California to more closely track what they are in the rest of the country, that places that have not seen the same ruinous increase in housing costs that are causing so many harms of so many kinds. I think many of us are familiar with the financial burden of high rents in California, but it's not just that burden. You see a number of other harms associated with our housing crisis, including exclusion, where people are denied the opportunity to live in areas with the best access to economic and educational opportunities, and denied that chance to improve their lives and the lives of their families. We see displacement, where people are pushed out of communities where they have lived often their entire lives by rising housing costs. And closely connected to that, we see sprawl, where they get pushed out farther and farther from job centers in the Bay Area core, places like Antioch and Tracy and Modesto. They're still working in the Bay Area core. They're driving now hours each day, time that they're away from their families, away from their communities, and all that traffic is generating a lot of pollution, both particulate pollution and carbon pollution. So longer commutes are one of the major challenges for California, meeting our goals on climate change. The good news and the bad news here is that this is a problem of our own devising. California is not an impoverished state. In fact, here in the Bay Area, we have a tremendous center of wealth and prosperity and economic opportunity that provides the resources we need to address our housing needs. We are the victims of a bad policy framework that over the past decades has blocked the housing we need in the places that we need it. We see restrictive zoning that makes it effectively illegal in much of California to build new housing because you're only allowed to build one particular housing type, a single-family home, on much of the land in our cities. I know this for San Francisco offhand, 72% of parcels in San Francisco, it is illegal to build an apartment building. We cannot solve our housing crisis if that continues to be the case. We have cumbersome and uncertain permitting processes that in some cities it can take years for a law-compliant proposal to build new housing to be approved, creating uncertainty for people seeking to build new housing and added costs and delaying the housing we need. And we have funding issues, both in terms of impact fees that cities impose on new housing, that in some places reach hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit, and in terms of available funding sources for dedicated affordable housing, which requires subsidy in order to be built, and we do not have the necessary funding streams to provide that at the level that we need. A problem of this scale, we believe at California Unity, requires a comprehensive statewide solution. I think this problem is too big to be solved by any one city alone. It goes beyond our city boundaries. It affects everyone in the state, and so we need the state to step in and provide additional tools and solutions to address our housing crisis. We are supporting dozens of bills to that end in California Unity from all three of the elements that Michael talked about: tenant protection, preservation of existing affordable housing, and production of new housing at all income levels. One that I want to focus on right now at the start is one that we've talked a bit about already, and that is SB 50, the More Homes Act. I think this is a really exciting and ambitious piece of legislation that has transformative potential for land use and housing in California. It's not in and of itself going to solve all our problems, but I think it would be a huge step in the right direction. SB 50 is aimed at addressing this question. We need 3.5 million new homes in California. Where will they go? And do that by making it legal and possible to build those homes in the places where we need them most, which are areas that are well served by quality transit and areas that have high access to good jobs. We think that by adding new housing in those areas, we can help people have better access to economic and educational opportunities without having to spend all of their time commuting long distances in cars, without putting new cars on the road, because they'll have access to transit, because they'll be living near where they work, and the other things that are important to them in their lives. We're including strong affordability requirements in this bill because we want to be sure that as we build new housing in California, we are including everyone who needs housing in the state, including those who are struggling most, as well as strong anti-displacement protections because we know that it is possible to build new housing without displacing and tearing down people who already have a place to live here in California. So we have strong protections for those people, both for direct and indirect displacement. We've been able to build, I think, a really impressive and broad coalition around this bill. It's supported by both the California Labor Federation and the California Chamber of Commerce, two groups who are not often on the same side of political issues. We have support from a number of environmental organizations, including NRDC, the California League of Conservation Voters, and Fossil Free California, because they recognize the great potential of this bill to help us move away from sprawl development and toward transit-oriented, climate-friendly development. We are supported by affordable housing developers, including the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, who are actually co-sponsoring this bill with us at California YIMBY. They represent, I believe, hundreds of affordable housing developers in the Bay Area. They recognize the great potential this bill will have to help them fulfill their mission of creating dedicated affordable housing for the people most in need in California, and doing that in areas that are currently off limits to them due to restrictive zoning. We have support here in Silicon Valley from the San Jose State students, as well as Silicon Valley Young Democrats, and from AARP California, because I think there's a recognition that people in every stage of life are struggling with our housing crisis and need us to do something differently. The status quo is just not working for almost everyone in California. We need some big changes like this. We're also very proud to have Assemblymember Evan Lowe, Assemblymember Ash Kalra, Assemblymember Kansan Chu co-authoring this bill with us. We would love to have Assemblymember Berman join us in this coalition. And happy to talk more about the bill as we go forward, answer people's questions about it, as well as some of the other bills that we're supporting in California YIMBY to address our housing crisis and the tremendous need for more housing everywhere in California.
Thank you very much, Aaron. So I'm going to open it up now. We got some questions coming here, and as they come up, I'm going to start with you, Shelley, of course. So other than sort of local control, and I've asked you this before, but I'm very curious, other than local control, what are the arguments against something like SB 50, and how can we sort of justify local control if we do agree that housing is important and is a need? How can we justify not building more housing and instead maintaining local control?
Well, I think when you put it that way, it's a little bit of a false dichotomy, right? Like, you can have local control and build more housing also, right? So let's just, I don't want to sort of leave that sitting there. I mean, I do agree that, and what we've heard quite a bit is that the local control argument is an argument that cities tend to make in particular, but maybe isn't really resonating right now at the state level. For the exact reason that I think everybody sort of pointed out about how do we get into this crisis and how did zoning in particular contribute to the crisis, right? But I will say, I think there is less of an argument against and more of a what do we need to make this possible. So if you talk to the staff person who staffs the League's Housing Policy Committee, he'll say there are 450,000 units of housing entitled that are not being built. And so why aren't those being built? And I think the other thing you would hear from cities is cities can create the conditions for building housing through zoning, through support for housing, but we don't, especially as smaller cities, we don't actually do the building. So how we are being held accountable for that, we need to think. One of the things I've been saying recently is that what I really would, and by the way, I haven't taken a position on the bill, so, I would venture to guess, I have a few colleagues in the room, that cities would like to be seen as partners rather than as enemies. And I feel like a lot of what is happening now is cities are being treated as enemies and the problem. I don't disagree that there are definitely cities who have done a lot to really keep, in particular, high dense housing out. That is certainly the case, and we have seen the state step in particular, Southern California city, Huntington Beach, which is being sued for its zoning, which really prohibited any new housing from being built. But I think we could be more successful to the point of it being a regional problem, which I could not agree more. Cities the size of Sunnyvale, Redwood City, or even cities the size of San Jose and San Francisco are not going to be able to solve this problem alone, because we all live in a region at this point, and so we need to be working together. So we need to be not only partners with each other, but we need to be partners with the state in how we think about addressing this problem.
So my question is very unfair, and I apologize. It was definitely sort of
No
pandering,
worries.
and I'm gonna ask mainly questions that I get every day, and this is my outlet, to sort of push them on to you guys.
Did you just record the calls you get and then you're just like play them?
They're recorded in my head, and they just play in loop. Everyone should be a staffer someday.
We didn't get these in advance, by the way.
That's true.
Yeah.
But I'll sort of, and I do think Redwood City is an example, and Sunnyvale is an example of cities who have done quite a good job of building housing, and they are certainly, relative to some of their neighbors, are doing a good job in terms of building housing. And I guess my question, Aaron, for you, and it's sort of piggybacking off some questions here, is how can we sort of take into account the cities that are doing a good job when we do try to pass statewide legislation to sort of force, or you can pick any word you want, but to force housing construction in smaller cities, because as you know, as everyone knows, Los Altos Hills is very different than San Francisco. I mean, Half Moon Bay is not Los Angeles. So how do we sort of take this SB 50 and take into account the cities that are doing well, and take into account the differences of the cities that are in the state?
Yeah. So I think one starting point for us, there was a UCLA study recently. They looked at all the housing elements of every city in California. Every city in California is required to report in their housing element, their zone capacity to meet their housing needs. And what they found is if you add up all the zone capacity that all the cities in California were reporting, it was not enough to get us to our goal of 3.5 million homes. So this is our starting point, is that the current zone capacity we have in California is inadequate to our needs. What we do with SB 50 is we set baseline standards. I think there's been some exaggeration in some of the rhetoric around the bill that it completely does away with local control over land use. I don't think that's the case. It sets baseline standards and requirements that we think are reasonable to meet our housing needs. Specifically that around rail transit, areas that represent billions of dollars of collective investment, not just by local governments, but by the entire state of California, often federal money as well. You should allow mid-rise apartment buildings of 4 to 5 stories. And then in other areas with high-quality bus service and areas that are near good-paying jobs, we are leaving in place local standards around height and building form. Most of the things that cities regulate will be left in place, but what we are saying is that you can't say it's okay to build a mansion, but it's not okay to build a fourplex. I think that's a basic standard of fairness that is reasonable for the state to set, and it leaves a lot in the hands of local cities to determine. Affordable housing requirements can still be set by local governments. Demolition controls can still be set by local governments. Objective design standards, including in most of the areas covered by SB 50, standards around height and lot coverage and building mass will still be in the hands of local governments. We are simply setting some baseline standards about what we think is appropriate in terms of making sure that cities in California are including everyone, and that the major collective investments that we have made around mass transit are accessible to everyone. Because those are needs that we have as an entire state that are not confined to the boundaries of individual cities.
Thank you. And then, Michael, as we talked about SB 50, you sort of touched on this earlier with the CASA Compact, and again, to sort of bring my job into it, is we get calls at our office pretty much every day saying, I support the CASA Compact, or I oppose the CASA Compact. That doesn't, to us, that doesn't really mean anything as staff, because it's a series of ideas, not to mention a series of bills, some of which are, like you said, it is truly bringing together of a lot of varying interests. And obviously those interests, once it's no longer a CASA Compact and now it's a series of bills, like California Apartment Association, California Association of Realtors, are gonna support SB 50. They're not gonna support rent control, rent protection increases, they're not gonna support getting rid of. So we're not voting on CASA. How sort of is, as now a representative, I guess, of CASA, if you'll let me title you that, how do you sort of move forward with advocacy for CASA with that in mind?
So we're advocates for good policy, and I think that's what our very caucus members and our legislators expect from us, is to bring them the ideas, those of us who are working, in the trenches day after day, to be able to bring our best ideas. But there's also the political element as well, and what's feasible and what's possible. And so we wanted to bring those two together. What's the best policy and the best politics that also, and that's the other question, how do you carve out and identify and work with the good actors, and then really focus in on those who are just resisting, participating in the human experience, as it were. And so we come up with ideas, and we had talked to, for example, to Sunnyvale and others who were hearing from those same constituents. Are there ways that for us in terms of transit upzoning, the main idea is that we've got all these public investments in transportation, right? So it shouldn't even be a debate. Billions of dollars invested, whether it's BART or whatever, or the Caltrain now, et cetera. When you make those types of public investments, and then you want to build single-family homes around the station area, that doesn't really work in terms of just the highest and best use, and really utilizing precious public dollars for those types of investments. And so we look at it, I think that way, in a coordinated way, and it's not punitive in any way, et cetera. It's just trying to make our systems function better. But could it be that, for example, and we mentioned this to the author, that if you were within 90% of the zoning capacity, but you had your own specific or precise plan that you had adopted, they got you most of the way there, given those investments in public transportation. Could there be a process where you could appeal to HCD, and they would say, that this specific plan or that precise plan does the same function, but the value of SB 50 is to hold kind of a threshold there and a standard based on what we're trying to accomplish in terms of upzoning around quality transportation. So those are the kinds of ideas that I'm really excited to be able to work with enlightened elected officials who are open to this kind of discussion. I agree that the tenor of the League of California Cities and their representatives is actually excellent. They have very good lobbyists in the building in Sacramento, and people who are, I think, really trying to find solutions and not just say hell no.
I think you sort of touched on this, among other things, but this conversation about transportation is so connected to this conversation about housing. And one of the things that many cities do, and probably rightfully so, express concern over, is how do we maintain our transportation infrastructure, which is already heavily impacted, while we continue to build all these new housing units. And Aaron, I guess my question, as a pedestrian and an urbanist, I suppose, there's a lot of conversation around making sure that transit continues to be built, and SB 50 is heavily dependent on transit. And one of the things that it's dependent on also is like the bus routes stay a certain way. And I guess that combining some questions here is, how are you, is there a concern that cities, especially the bad actors, will start to manipulate transit and manipulate schedules, like bus schedules, to directly go against SB 50? And then on the other side of the coin, what do you see as a solution that the state can do, or that locally folks can do, to invest more in transportation, not just trains, buses, but bike infrastructure, ped infrastructure, to try and make it easier and more palatable for these housing units to be built? It's a lot, but transit.
Yeah.
I think you might be off.
Can we hear me now? Great. Big fan of transit. Definitely believe that continued investment in improving transit is essential to California's future and the Bay Area's future. I think SB 50 is fully consistent with that and will help build the case for better transit by allowing more people to live near and use that transit on a daily basis, and build a political constituency to demand from our legislators continued investments in improved transit, as well as you mentioned, investments in improved pedestrian and bike infrastructure As we allow more people to live near transit and live near jobs, they're going to be, I believe, more and more invested in those connections that allow them to reach transit safely, that allow them to walk or bike to work safely. I think in terms of manipulation of transit to get around SB 50, it's funny, I live along 2 bus routes that have been there for longer than they were buses. They were streetcar routes. The streetcars were removed. They're now bus routes. That is the way in which SB 50 would directly cover the area where I live. I think many of the people who are most opposed to transit improvements are already opposed to them before SB 50 has come into place. I think the level at which those decisions are made is often not at the individual city level. We have SamTrans, we have BTA making decisions about transit routes. Obviously, local governments have a say in that, but I think it's a broader level of decision making that I think is less influenced by some of the few loud voices of no. But I think the biggest thing is if we're going to be investing in transit, we need to be sure that people can use it, and that means people have to be able to live near it to justify that investment. Because it doesn't do us any good to be running transit service to nowhere. We have to be able to get the most out of those investments, and that means removing some of the restrictive zoning that makes it impossible for us to do that because we only allow mansions around this wonderful investment we've made in public mobility and access.
Yeah, it just takes a quick sec. So I just wanted to add a couple of things. First of all, I had a question. Isn't the bus component of SB 50, hasn't that been taken out of the bill?
No, the bus component is still very much part of the bill. It's been altered. So in so the standard around buses is significantly less than the standard around rail transit. It involves form-based zoning. So if you allow a building of a certain size, you have to allow that to be either, you can't restrict that to be only single-family home, only one-plex. You have to allow, this is really oriented at allowing some of the smaller middle housing types, like triplexes and small apartment buildings, and it places some limits on parking minimums, but it does not include the requirement to allow at least 4 to 5 stories, which is in place around rail transit to invest greater capacity and investment.
Okay, thanks. So there are a couple of other pieces that I want to just touch on, because I think the other impacts are not just to transit, but they're also to schools. And so one of the things, and this was one of the challenges with the potential funding mechanisms for the CASA sort of regional agency, and I know it was just a list of suggestions, but just one of the conversations that we had, school districts were not engaged in that conversation at all, and one of the pieces was potentially to take developer fees that go to schools and have that go to whatever that regional agency was. My concern about that is we want more housing, that means more kids. And it's my belief that people are gonna raise families in multifamily housing. They're not all gonna move into single family homes. Prop 13 has helped constrict the supply of single family homes because you stay once you're there because your property taxes help pretty level. But if we need to provide a way for schools and school districts to address an increase in students that we expect will come with additional housing. And so in addition to investing in transportation, which I completely agree with, we have to also be investing in our schools. We have to be investing not just in schools in general, but we have to be investing in school infrastructure. And that's going to vary widely across the state depending on where your school population is now. In some districts like my own, the population is declining. In other districts, right next door, it's growing. And so there is a lot of nuance to that we have to work on. And then that gets to sort of the regional aspect of the transportation piece, because to your point, we don't make decisions about how often Caltrain runs. We don't have any decision-making power about, about BART and other public transportation pieces that are not well connected to each other. So I do think the state does have a role in that to help us better connect our transportation systems. And then the last thing I'll say is we definitely need more money for bike and pedestrian improvements across our cities, because we can build, so for example, in Redwood City, we're gonna be building a bike lane on El Camino, a protected bike lane. But when you get to San Carlos, it's gonna be gone. And when you come up from Atherton, you're not gonna be in a protected bike lane. So the connectivity of bike lanes and pedestrian infrastructure really has to be a component of all of these conversations.
And so just to clarify, so the school facilities impact fees would have not been touched. And the developers pay that, neither would the school portion of the property taxes. I think what was being conceived of talking about, quite frankly, Senator Bell has a bill, which is a form of redevelopment he's bringing back, which actually talks about ERAF, which in itself can be controversial. It's small, but it's educational, revenue augmentation fund, but we'll say that for another night. But and even talking about education can be controversial because we all want to protect the school portion. I think that was the idea. The larger picture was just, could you have a joint powers authority at the county level, which still, falls under Prop 13 limits about how the property tax is distributed. You wouldn't touch that. But where you would have agreements where jurisdictions, cities, and county would come together to take some of the increment and the increase in property taxes. And as you know, year over year, over the past few years, property tax assessed values increased double digits, and property taxes because of the boom really in the pop in commercial and office development in particular. So the idea was to have a portion of that be dedicated, try to address the jobs housing gap and to fund some workforce housing. So that was just one proposal out of about a dozen different funding proposals. But there again are constitutional issues and political issues, et cetera, that would have to be vetted and dealt with, and elected officials would have to vote on before anything like that could even be implemented.
I do want to give two quick shout outs to, in response to the question about funding for schools and regional integration of transit. For school funding, I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention on this, the schools and communities first. It's going to be on the ballot in 2020 to reform Prop 13. So the corporations pay their fair share, raise $8 to $12 billion per year, half of which would be dedicated to schools. I think is a great way to address some of those needs. And then I believe I saw Dean 11 in the back, so for those of you who are interested in better regional integration of our transit service, she's a great person to talk to because I agree that's a huge need as somebody who takes a lot of regional transit. There's some challenges sometimes.
Yeah, I actually want to ask a question quickly about regionalism. We love regionalism in a lot of ways, about transportation, about there's a big push in our state to have the state-run healthcare. There's a big push to have the state oversee transit. There's a big push to have the state do actually more and get their hands on more things. While at the same time, when it comes to housing, there's a very strong push against regionalism. And sort of using Brisbane as an example, also in San Jose County, they have this massive plot of land.
You're not welcome back.
I don't think I'm welcome in Brisbane anyways, but I was at a city council meeting in Brisbane, and they have a massive plot of land sort of right off 101, right by Caltrain, and there was conversation of developing it and basically creating millions of square feet of office space and zero housing at the time. And one of the speakers at the city council hearing used a nuclear bomb analogy, and he said, if a city has a nuclear bomb, should they just be allowed to blow it up and not have any say and have their neighbors have no say? If Brisbane blows up a nuclear bomb, that affects Daly City, that affects all of the regional cities, and nobody would sit there and say, yeah, well, it's your city, it's your bomb, you do your thing. Everyone would get involved. But when they're sort of doing something, I guess obviously the parallel is by creating this level of housing, you are doing that. or this lack of housing, this level of jobs. Can you all, I guess, talk a little bit about regionalism and sort of threading that balance between taking the regionalistic approach when people seem to want it, but then also the state sort of staying out of things when it has to do with maybe an apartment complex that's on your block. We'll start with you, Shelby.
Well, allow me to speak for all cities. We'll turn it on here.
I just in case you didn't hear me, I am going to speak for all cities and every single city council member in California. So, you know, it's interesting. We just had a conversation. There's an annual conference that our River City Chamber puts on that has a lot of elected officials, has a lot of business people, has a lot of variety of people, and one of the breakout sessions was on regionalism this year, and it was moderated by former Assemblymember Rich Gordon to talk about and you know, Rich talked a lot about governance structures and how the region this state has evolved over the years that it's been a state, and that we have not evolved our governance structures. And I can't do any justice to the way that he is so good at speaking, but he talked about evolution and how adaptation is what allows species, it's a Darwin quote, adaptation is what allows species to survive rather than just being the strongest. And so he was using that in the context of how might we think about adapting our governance structures to address some of these regional issues that we've been talking about tonight. How do you have that balance between communities that are unique, that have their own character, and that like that character, but are also willing to change and evolve and grow? And how do you balance that with the needs of an entire region that has significant challenges, which we've been talking about this whole night? And so it was the beginning of a conversation, but I would say for the most part, people who attended were taken by, at least let's think about having this conversation. Let's talk about what might make sense, what might not make sense, and how could you put it together, but it would take time.
And so the way I think about it too is, for example, I use the analogy of the bay itself. I want to save the bay, right? And it doesn't, but there's the issue of externality, so it doesn't help for San Mateo or Santa Clara County to want to save the bay if a neighboring county wants to do their own thing in the name of local control and pollute, or, you know, whatever. We have standards, basic standards, and we can go over and above that as a state. We can't go beneath that. And for me, housing is a civil rights issue. And so there are basic standards that we can't fall below. And there are lots of laws where we have state preemption, or where the state really covers the field of a particular area of the law, because those are the standards saying at the state level. We have that for education. For example, we have that in healthcare, and yet sometimes, you know, for in terms of housing, we don't really see that same connection. So in some ways, have that kind of Wild West mentality. I think there are lots of upsides if we pitch the regionalism as coordination, cooperation, value add, bringing best practices, technical expertise, and resources, so we don't have to have duplicative efforts at every small government, which with tremendous inefficiencies and additional layers of government, actually. As long as we maintain that balance with democracy, and that's the challenge that we have. But if democracy means I'm going to shut out people completely because my neighborhood character means something else to me that may be more nefarious than I'm willing to admit. Or we have fiscal incentives where it's in my best interest just to attract, you know, jobs, and then have someone else supply the housing for my workers. Those are the types of tough issues that we have to wrestle with. And the additional challenge in the Bay Area is that our council of governments that we call the ABAG is 9 counties. Other counties, it's just 1 county in the incorporated cities. So it's even more complex. And then on top of that, we have the ABAG and MTC structures, which are 2 separate boards of elected officials. So you can imagine how that will go. And we're trying to get at that with some mergers. So I think efficiency while maintaining democracy is the way of the future. But it's a struggle, and people always fear, I think, regionalism, what they have historically, and they've used this sort of the punching bag and the other out there, when in fact I think we need to rethink the way that we present this and really treat it the way we do when we want to save the day. And we passed a measure, 2/3 measure, to direct resources to do that, and we need to do those same kinds of efforts, I think, to face some of our other challenges.
So I'm gonna jump in here, and unless you have something that you really wanna say on this topic.
That's okay.
I like this question. I like all the questions. They're great. But what bill other than SB 50 are you sort of most interested in that's moving through the legislature right now? I want all of you to answer this question. So I'll start with Aaron.
Yeah. So as I said, there are dozens of bills that we are supporting. I'm going to pick two from my personal state senator, who I really admire, Nancy Skinner. SB 18, which is a bill to provide greater legal and rental assistance to people facing eviction, with the idea that it is much cheaper and more effective to prevent homelessness before it happens, before people have to experience that trauma, than to simply focus on addressing it once people are already unhoused. As well as SB 330, which is a bill with a lot of moving parts, but it strengthens a lot of the provisions that effectively require cities to follow their own laws around housing. I mentioned at the very beginning the sometimes capricious and uncertain permitting process that proposals for new housing, which we so desperately need, often face. SB 330 would help address that. It would set limits on the amount of time and the number of public hearings that a proposal for new development can be required to go through by cities before they provide a yes or no answer on whether somebody's going to be allowed to build the new homes that we need. It has a number of other versions as well, but I think it's a big, exciting, ambitious bill, and I will trust that my friends at the table will address some of the other wonderful bills being considered.
So looking at your chart here, and this is actually incredibly helpful and well done, but there, I think Zach had mentioned over 200 bills in the legislature this year. I'll just point out a few on here that Aaron hadn't mentioned, but I'm also really excited about. I know that California, for example, is, I think, one of the sponsors of the SCA 1, which is a constitutional amendment 1. Senator Allen from Southern California, the bill is actually sponsored by Mayor Garcetti, the city of Los Angeles. But this would repeal what we call Article 34 of the state constitution. How many have heard of Article 34? Okay. Very informed group. So sophisticated communities know about this, right? But no one else does, right? And it was actually adopted in 1950, and at that time, the California Association of Realtors had sponsored the initiative. It basically requires a plebiscite whenever you want to finance affordable housing at the local level. We call it publicly assisted, but it could even be any kind of affordable housing that requires a state or local subsidy. The voters would have to vote on that. You can imagine why that may have been the case, and you can remember just the backlash to public housing and the green and all those kinds of things, and then racial components and segregation, etc. But the good news is the California Association of Realtors is actually co-sponsoring the repeal now. And they think now is the time when we do as well. And part of the issue too, apart from the civil rights angle on this, which I think is foremost and most important, it's just also the practical issue of having to go out and have voters approve and delay, or trying to finance and set up ways of financing with less than a majority of your funding from a particular public source. It just creates additional burdens and costs, including that financing structure and delays to building the housing. That's one of the reasons, in addition to the civil rights angle, Mayor Garcetti supported it. So we should support that. And what a Senate constitutional amendment means is that it requires 2/3 votes of both the Assembly and the Senate, and it goes directly to the ballot. Then it would go in November of 2020. It doesn't even require a gubernatorial signature, which is an interesting thing. But there's another constitutional amendment which we also are following and supporting, which is ACA 1 at the top of your chart there under ballot measures. And this one would lower the voter approval requirement to 55% for infrastructure and affordable housing. We've lowered the voter threshold before. We lowered it to 55% for school facilities, in the year 2000. That was Prop 39, you may remember. And the idea is it's still a supermajority, it's just a smaller supermajority, from 2/3 to 55%, so that we still have democracy. If a supermajority wants to invest in their own communities, they should at least be given the opportunity to do that. So that's ACA 1. I just want to quickly point out the ADU bills. For example, Senator Wachowski's bill, SB 13, is moving along. A couple of things that it does is it creates a sliding scale based on the size of the ADU for fees, accessory dwelling units or casitas. And it also would prohibit an owner occupancy requirement, which we think particularly when homes are the median home is 1.5 million or something, you're just going to have more rental housing in general, single family rentals. And some argue that, well, you could have large corporations or syndicates buying up homes and then create additional rentals. That already happened, quite frankly. Blackstone did all that during the Great Recession and bought up those homes. But now we actually need a rental housing stock, including single family homes. So we think that going to be able to add an ADU, is appropriate. I think for financing, it's also important. So those ADU bills are moving this session as well. And then finally, I'll just point out, I mentioned it briefly, but SB 5 by Senator Bell, which is an attempt to provide funding if you set up a tax increment financing program at the local level, like redevelopment, that the state will contribute a portion as well and keep the schools whole. They'll backfill the property taxes that go to schools to be able to create a more robust program of tax increment financing for investment infrastructure and affordable housing at the local level. So those are some of the key ones that I wanted to call out.
Well, ACA 1, who's going to be 1?
Okay. ACA 1 was the one I was going to talk about, but then I would also say, at least as it stood, AB 11 by 2, which would bring back some form of redevelopment. Devil's in the details on that one, but some form of redevelopment, I think cities would need it.
Thank you very much. And then we're just going to end with one last question, and then we'll get you out of here and get me back to my baby. Is as you track, as we do have a piece of advice, I guess, for us, for the people in the audience, for how to A, get involved in this process, and B, how to, don't say to call my office. We're short staffed, like call us in a week.
How else are they supposed to get involved?
Call Senator Hill's office. But how do you track the bills? How do you stay involved? How do you stay up to date? Do you guys have any sort of tricks that you can share with folks here?
I think you should join your local YIMBY group. We have leaders here from South Bay YIMBY and Peninsula for Everyone who I know would be happy to talk with you and tell you about ways to get involved. Those groups are very active in supporting many of the great bills that we've been talking about and receive a lot of news and information and updates from us at California YIMBY about how they can most effectively engage with the legislature and including ways that we have set up to make it easier for everyone to contact, not your office at this point, soon to come I'm sure, but some key Senate offices around some of these bills that are being considered, particularly SB 50. So that's my advice, join YIMBY.
Surprise.
They would fire me if I didn't say that. And rightly so.
I mean, it is your job. But I would also say a couple of things. One is your council members are tracking these bills as well, and they're working with their staff on them. So stay in touch so you know the impacts on your cities and how your cities are thinking about it. And two, I mean, there's too many bills to track individually, right? Like you just can't. It's not going to be possible. Even the sitting legislators will tell you like they're not tracking. If it's in the other house right now, they're not even really following it. Probably other than SB 50. But stay connected to your local council members, and I do think also some of, I don't know about the Republican Party, but I do know that many of the Democratic clubs are also tracking several of these bills. As you mentioned, the Young Dems have taken positions on them. So if you're not active with your local party and you want to get involved with them, some of these housing bills in particular are of great interest to them right now.
Please follow me on Twitter. My handle is @Michael D. No, we'll try to keep you up to date in real time there. But also, I would say our partner, our regional partner, the Nonprofit Housing Association within California, on their website they have some template support letters that you can use and fact sheets for particular bills that they're sponsoring, co-sponsoring. And then I have some business cards. Feel free to follow up with me. We actually do have a large bill tracker with a spreadsheet, and we can help you and we can show you what our support letters are, etc. And then talk through bills if you're always open to doing that as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and I will add, do reach out to our office. God, it physically pains me. But we do like to hear, what folks think. We like to hear people's opinion on bills. We get some emails from a very small number of people on a lot of different bills, but we don't get a ton of sort of opinions on a lot of these bills. Most of these bills we won't get a single letter in support or in opposition to, and it's good for us to know what folks do think. And the Assemblymember Berman sees all of those letters and keeps track of everything that people are writing to us, and it is helpful. It is helpful when we're voting on a bill to know what people are actually contacting us about. The other thing I'll sort of end with quickly is, if you find yourself quoting, this is, I guess, a plea, but if you find yourself quoting Donald Trump, you're probably in the wrong. So don't call our office and say, our city's full, or our region's full. That is what Donald Trump just said. And don't call our office and say, we need to build a wall around one city specifically. That's what Donald Trump says. And I guess, no offense if you do say those things, but just, we're not in support of him. We don't like Donald Trump. And so you're not going to get a lot of ground with us if you call and you quote our president to us. So that's my ending plea. And I do want to say a huge thank you to the three of you. Can we give them a round of applause? And thank you all for coming out here tonight. I'm going to hand it back to Richard, or if you read it.
Thank you all for coming out. It's been a great, very informative evening. I just want to thank you all for coming out. I want to thank our elected officials and other dignitaries, especially. We have Mayor Larry Klein of the City of Sunnyvale, Councilmember Glenn Hendricks, former mayor, Councilmember Nancy Smith, Councilmember Michael Goldman, my very own DPAC Chair, John Cortez. We have the city's housing director, Jenny Carloni. We have Sunnyvale School District President, Nancy Newkirk. And we have former vice mayor, of the city of Sunnyvale, Tara Martin-Milius. Thank you all for coming out and joining us. I apologize if I missed anyone. I also want to thank Jason Uhlenkott for recording this. We'll make sure to post the video after the event. Finally, I want to thank our panelists, and we actually have a little something for you as in gratitude for coming out here. And here you all go. Finally, I want to mention a couple of meetings that might be of interest. This event was again co-hosted by Livable Sunnyvale and the Sunnyvale Democratic Club. We're also very involved in tracking and considering these various bills that are working their way through. The next Livable Sunnyvale meeting is May 1st, 6:30 p.m. at Toyota Sunnyvale, their conference room on the second floor. We're going to be hearing from Milo Trouse about proposed development within the city, as well as holding our annual steering committee elections. Our next Democratic Club meeting is May 18th, where we will also be holding our board elections. And I'm sorry, Mike, I'm blanking on the agenda for that,
The
but.
agenda is Sunnyvale district elections.
We'll be looking at Sunnyvale district elections. Anyway, thank you so much for turning out, and I'm gonna let Zach get back to his baby. Thank you.